Shalom, friends. I am Rabbi Michael Panitz, and this is the sanctuary of Temple Israel in Norfolk, Virginia. I'm very happy to be able to speak to you from the pulpit of the sanctuary once again. If you are joining us for the first time, welcome. If you've been part of these services and messages in previous weeks, welcome back. This Shabbat, I have a fairly somber theme, although it does have a hopeful conclusion. The title of the sermon for this Shabbat is When Heritage Looks in the Mirror and Sees Hate. This was my personal introduction to the interpretation of the Confederate battle flag by real live Virginians in 1993. I had recently arrived in Norfolk, and my trusty but somewhat aged automobile gave up the ghost. I bought a wonderful used car, a Honda Civic. It was low to the ground, and when I drove it, it wouldn't be difficult for a motorist passing me to see the kippah on my head. I was merging onto Route 64 East at the Tidewater Drive ramp. On my left, a pickup truck was passing me. It was one of those souped-up models, raised high up above its axles. It sported a gun rack and a large stars and bars flag. The driver took one look at me and swerved his truck towards me, forcing me off the road. Fortunately, I was able to come to a stop on the grass beyond the shoulder of the highway without further damage. I looked up just in time to see his middle finger saluting into his rearview mirror. So pardon me if I am skeptical about the claims that the favored flag of the Confederate armies represents heritage, not hate. If there's any heritage there, it is precisely a heritage of hate. The debate that seemed intractable in America until recently concerning the interpretation of the Confederate battle flag is a specific instance of a more general question. How do we know what a symbol means? How do we know if a swastika is a Nazi emblem of racism or an ancient Hindu image conveying wishes for good fortune? We know because we see how it is used in the context of real life. The crooked cross meant one thing in the Indian subcontinent 1,000 years ago. It meant something else in Germany in the last century. What does it mean today? Look at how it's used. In Charlottesville, 2017, at the Unite the Right rally, it was used to mobilize not only protesters defending a statue, but people marching by torchlight like the mob in the Frankenstein movies and chanting bigoted slogans. Jews will not replace us. Just as was done by the original Nazis who first idolized that flag, the Americans waving the Nazi banner perpetrated violence in keeping with the ideology it symbolized. The flag has remained the emblem of white supremacists, of so-called Christian nationalists, and of the anti-Semites of the far right. This is an uncomfortable thing to say, but it is confirmed by the real-life context of those who waved that banner. They were marching in line together with those carrying the stars and bars. What does it mean to see people carrying the Nazi flag marching together with those carrying the Confederate battle flag? It means that for those people, white supremacist and racist thinking are ready bedfellows, twin beliefs about the world. If indeed there are some quote-unquote very fine people among those who carry the Confederate battle flag, as we heard in 2017, they are singularly clueless about their allies. These thoughts have come back to me because of recent events. The murder of George Floyd has sparked a round of protests. This is not unprecedented, but the strength and staying power of the protests, coupled with the often divisive overreactions from certain official quarters, and all of that in the midst of where we are in our nation's history, have created a momentum for change. We have seen in the past few weeks changes that seemed unachievable just weeks earlier. These changes involve symbols deeply rooted in the American psyche. Monuments that were erected during the heyday of Southern white resistance to the outcome of the Civil War have been defaced and removed. Advertising logos with racist overtones are being retired. No more Uncle Ben, no more Aunt Jemima. Surely rice and pancake syrup can be sold on their merits and not on the nostalgia for the so-called good old days of an openly racist and segregationist America. Most recently, one of the bastions of Confederate pride, the stock car racing organization NASCAR, has decided to ban the use of Confederate flags. The decision came after one of the leading drivers, Darrell Bubba Wallace, Jr., called for the change. He is one of the few African American drivers competing at the top echelon of that sport. Indeed, the culture of the sport has been almost a preserve of whites, and it was the most prominent venue in American sports for the display of the Confederate flag. NASCAR doubtless wants to find a way to gain a wider popularity, but I'm not cynical in that regard. I believe that the sports organization leaders want to do the right thing as well. We should note with dismay that there's been an ugly backlash to NASCAR's decision to ban the Confederate battle flag at its events. Someone, apparently a sports insider with access to restricted areas, placed a noose, an emblem of the Ku Klux Klan lynching of African Americans, in Wallace's automobile stall. But NASCAR has reacted vigorously against that. There was no dog whistle splitting of the difference between the racists and anti-racists in this instance. As a Jewish boy from Minnesota sang 60 years ago, "Oh, the times, they are a-changin'." The phenomenon of a long, long period of seeming stasis, followed by what feels like sudden change, is familiar to us from the core stories of the Bible. The Israelites endured their enslavement for the entire tenure of the Pharaoh Seti. Then, during the rule of his successor, Ramesses II, the Bible tells us, they cried out to God, and then God sent Moses to confront the Pharaoh. The slavery seemed endless because the people were resigned. Once they had found their voice, a solution began to develop. Similarly, the Israelites during the desert generation seemed hopelessly unable to think like a free people. They could carp and whine, but they could not handle the responsibilities of living in covenant with God. For 40 years, they remained in a kind of suspended animation, living as semi-nomads in a series of oases in the Sinai. The Promised Land was unapproachable for an entire generation. But when the next generation had reached its maturity, it was ready to cross the Jordan with decisive successes to follow. Here in America, I wonder if we aren't seeing a parallel. In our midst are people who were formally freed from slavery a long time ago, and yet who are still in the wilderness. Juneteenth was a century and a half ago and more, and yet its follow-up was massive resistance and segregation and KKK terror and the complicity of national leaders beyond the South. So many structures of inequality continue to work against the advancement of African Americans. Now, seeing what feels like sudden movement, I'm hopeful that for so many fellow Americans, the Promised Land is once again in sight. A flag coming down from a race car venue is a symbol. It is not in itself substantive change, but perhaps it shows that people's hearts have thawed. That gives us hope for tomorrow. May God help us to be the society we could be. May God crown our people with a truer brotherhood and sisterhood than we have known until now, from sea to shining sea. Amen.